Greetings, Thrillseekers. I am the Master Programmer, curator of hidden knowledge and eerie tales. Today, I bring you 3 haunting stories unearthed by Rasputin. These tales pull back the curtain on government secrets and show us the true evil that has been covered up. So, if you're looking for a fright, something scary to watch at night, stay with us as we delve into these 3 extraordinary tales. First, in Project Echo, a small town becomes a site of a mind control experiment. The result? A haunting disappearance that no one can explain. What happens when sound becomes a weapon and something unexpected answers? Next, in Blackwell Island, a crumbling asylum hides the horrifying aftermath of a classified experiment. Patients vanish, leaving behind whispers of shadows and strange markings. What was unleashed in the final days of Blackwell, and why was it erased from history? Finally, in The Ghost of Whitehall Archives, a government facility becomes a labyrinth of terror for an unsuspecting archivist. What secrets lie in the files marked classified, and what happens when the shadows come alive? These stories are not for the faint of heart, so sit back, turn down the lights, and prepare to be haunted by the sinister secrets Rasputin has uncovered. And if you enjoy our content, please subscribe to our channel for more chilling stories and dark discoveries. Welcome to another journey into the unknown, brought to you by the Dark Files. There's a town no one talks about. Its streets are overgrown, its homes abandoned, its name erased from maps. The people who live there? Gone, relocated under mysterious circumstances. The official story is simple. A chemical spill forced an evacuation. But the truth is buried in classified files under a name few have ever heard. Project Echo. In 1982, a quiet suburban community, known only as Grid 21, was chosen for an experiment. The project aimed to harness sound as a weapon, not to harm, but to control. Researchers believed certain frequencies can manipulate human emotions. Fear, anger, euphoria. They thought they could invoke these feelings with sound waves. In theory, they could calm riots, neutralize enemies, or even instill blind obedience. Grid 21 was a testing ground. Its residents, unaware of their role, went about their lives while the experiment unfolded around them. At first, the changes were subtle. Static crept into the radio broadcast. Streetlights buzzed faintly. Residents felt uneasy, but dismissed it as everyday stress. Then, tempers began to flare. Fights broke out over trivial matters. A parking spot, a lawnmower left out overnight. Old friends stopped speaking. Within weeks, the community began to unravel. Police were called daily for domestic disputes and violent altercations. A teacher attacked a student in the middle of class. A storeroom clerk barricaded herself in the stockroom, screaming about voices in their head. The tone wasn't just disrupting emotions, it was unraveling their sense of reality. On July 13, 1982, the experiment reached its breaking point. The researchers introduced a new frequency, one designed to amplify compliance. But instead of calming the residents, it pushed them into hysteria. Reports from the few who escaped described chaos. People shouting, weeping, wandering aimlessly through the streets. Some collapsed, disoriented and unable to move. Others grew violent, lashing out at anyone nearby. The researchers lost control. Unable to contain the panic, they issued an evacuation order. Residents were rounded up and relocated under military supervision, told they had been exposed to harmful chemicals. Those who resisted were sedated. By morning, Grid 21 was a ghost town. The government covered its tracks. The area was sealed off, and the town vanished from official records. The experiment was declared a failure, and Project Echo was quietly shut down. Some former residents, relocated under new identities, reported strange after effects. They spoke of hearing faint tones in the middle of the night, or feeling unexplained surges of rage. One claimed to wake up in a field miles from her home with no memory of how she got there. Today, the site of Grid 21 is an industrial park, but the locals still tell stories. Some say you can hear strange tones if you drive through the area late at night. And then there are the conspiracy theorists who believe the experiment never ended. They say Project Echo was only the beginning, a trial run for something bigger. The story of Grid 21 fades into the fog of forgotten history, a government experiment that ended in silence. But sometimes, silence is the loudest sound of all. Ethan Mallory thought it would be a routine assignment. As a journalist chasing stories, he'd heard the rumors about Blackwell Island, an asylum long shuttered and buried under layers of urban development and historical whitewashing. Officially, the asylum closed in the 1930s, its patients relocated to better facilities. But whispers claimed otherwise. Ethan wasn't the first to dig into the story, but he was determined to uncover the truth. He didn't know what he was walking into. The story started with a tip. A former nurse from Blackwell's final days had left behind a journal, its brittle pages filled with frantic, scrawled entries. Most were too damaged to read, but one line stuck with him. They see something we don't, and it sees them. Intrigued, Ethan tracked down other records, a series of death certificates for patients who had supposedly been transferred. They all shared a curious detail: no location for the bodies. It wasn't much, but it was enough for Ethan to board a tram to Roosevelt Island, camera in hand, to see what remained of Blackwell. The ruins of the asylum were hidden behind a fence, overgrown with weeds and ivy. The main building had been gutted years ago, but parts of the basement remained intact. Ethan found his way through a broken window, descending into the damp, crumbling tunnels below. At first, it seemed like any other abandoned building. Rusted pipes, graffiti, and the faint smell of mold. But as Ethan went deeper, strange details emerged. Scratch marks on the walls, symbols etched into the stone, spiraling and jagged. He took a photo of one, a series of concentric circles, and his camera immediately malfunctioned. The silence was deafening. He felt like he was being watched. Ethan found the first room by accident. The door was hanging off its hinges, revealing a chamber filled with rusted restraints bolted to the floor. Chains dangled from the ceilings, some still swinging slightly, as if disturbed. On the far wall was a phrase, scratched deeply into the plaster. "They took my name." It wasn't until he stepped into the room that he realized he wasn't alone. The figure stood in the corner, gaunt and unmoving. Ethan froze, the flashlight trembling in his grip. "Hello?" he whispered. "Are you okay?" The figure's head tilted, its face obscured in shadow. Slowly, it stepped forward, the sound of its bare feet scraping against the floor. Ethan tumbled back, the flashlight flickering, and the figure vanished, leaving nothing but silence in its wake. Shaken, Ethan retraced his steps, but the tunnels seemed to stretch endlessly, looping back on themselves. The symbols on the walls grew more frequent, more complex. His ears began to ring, a high-pitched tone that made him dizzy. He turned a corner and saw a group of figures standing at the far end of the hallway. There was at least 6 of them, all thin and pale, their heads twitching as if listening to something he couldn't hear. Ethan's voice caught in his throat as they turned towards him in unison. He ran. Ethan barely made it out of the tunnels. When he emerged, gasping for air, the sky had darkened, and the tram back to Manhattan was nowhere in sight. His phone was dead, his camera broken, but he still had the memory card. Back at his apartment, Ethan reviewed the footage. Most of it was distorted, filled with static and flickering frames. But in the final clip, just before the camera failed, he saw them. Figures standing in the shadows, their faces blurred, their mouths open as if screaming silently. Behind them, the obscure outline of a door glowing faintly in the dark. Ethan tried to write the story, but the words wouldn't come. A week later, he vanished. In the years since Ethan's disappearance, rumors about Blackwell Island have only grown. Locals talk about the nameless ones. Figures seen along the water's edge, their faces blank, their movements stuttering and unnatural. Some say the government still knows what happened on the island, and the experiments were never truly shut down. In the glowing door, no one knows where it leads. Blackwell Island is quiet now, its secrets buried deep, but the nameless ones are still waiting for the next person curious enough to look. There are places the government doesn't want you to know about, locations scrubbed from public records, buried beneath layers of bureaucracy. One such place is Whitehall Archives. David Klein was an archivist with the Department of Records, tasked with sorting through files from decommissioned government sites. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was steady. So when his supervisor handed him an assignment to visit the Whitehall facility, David didn't hesitate. He was given vague instructions: retrieve a set of old classified files and log their transfer to a secure location. Simple enough, but when he asked about the nature of the files, his supervisor's expression darkened. "Don't look at them, just bring them back." Whitehall was as unremarkable as David had imagined. A squat, concrete building surrounded by overgrown weeds and chain-link fencing. The air felt heavy as he entered, the flickering fluorescent lights casting long shadows across the narrow hallways. The main storage area was cavernous, filled with rows of metal shelving stretching into the dark. David's footsteps echoed as he navigated the labyrinth, following a map scribbled hastily on a piece of paper. It wasn't before long he realized something was wrong. The hum of the lights, the faint creak of the building, it was all too muted, like the sound was being swallowed. And then there were the smells: musty paper, old chemicals, and something faintly metallic, like blood. The files he was sent to retrieve were tucked away in a corner, marked only with the word "Crane" stamped across their aging folders. As David loaded them into his cart, a single folder slipped free and hit the floor. He opened it slightly, revealing a photograph. He picked it up without thinking. The image was grainy, black and white, but its subject was unmistakable. A pale figure standing in the middle of a barren room, its body contorted unnaturally, its eyes, if they were eyes, wide and staring. David felt a chill crawl down his spine. The longer he looked, the more wrong the image seemed. The figure's shadow didn't match its pose, and the faint markings on the wall behind it resembled scratches. He shoved the photograph back into the folder, heart pounding. As David made his way back toward the exit, he noticed something odd. The shelves around him were no longer neatly aligned. They jutted at strange angles, forming a path that led deeper into the archives. The map was useless now. No matter which way he turned, the rows seemed to rearrange themselves, guiding him towards something. And then he heard it. At first, it was faint, like a whisper carried on the wind. But as he moved, it grew louder. Indistinct voices overlapping, merging into a low, mournful wail. David's flashlight flickered, and he swore he saw movement at the edge of its beam. He stopped, heart racing. "Hello?" he called out, his voice trembling. The whispering stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then, from the darkness ahead, footsteps. David ran. He turned down aisle after aisle, but the row stretched endlessly. His flashlight died, plunging him into darkness. The whispers returned, louder now, surrounding him. He stumbled into an open area, nearly tipping over something on the floor. It was a chair bolted to the ground, its restraints rusted but intact. Around it, the walls were covered in scratch marks, words etched into the metal. "Let me out." He turned, and for a moment, he thought he saw a figure, tall, gaunt, its face obscured, but when he blinked, it was gone. When David finally found the exit, he collapsed onto the pavement outside, gasping for air. The files were still with him, but his mind raced with questions. What had he seen? Who, or what, was in there? The next morning, David tried to report his experience, but when he called his supervisor, the number had been disconnected. When he returned to the office, his access badge no longer worked. It was as if he'd never been employed there. Today, Whitehall archives remain sealed, their location known only to a handful of officials. But stories persist, of shadows moving behind its windows, of voices heard in the night. Some say the files stored there contain secrets too dangerous for the world to know. Others believe the building itself is haunted, cursed by the people whose lives were erased to protect those secrets. Whatever the truth, one thing is certain. Nobody goes to Whitehall anymore. So if you ever find yourself near an unmarked building with flickering lights, keep walking. Because some places weren't meant to be entered, and some files were never meant to be found. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the chills, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe to our page to stay updated. Stay vigilant. The unknown is always closer than you think.